Good morning, everyone, and thank you for bringing such dry weather today. My name is Azeem Azhar. I'll just give a brief introduction to myself, and then Dept and Joanna, if you can do the same. So I'm a founder and investor. I write a newsletter called Exponential View, which I hope some of you read. I'm also on the board of the Ada Lovelace Foundation, which is an independent research group looking at data ethics, and a member of the Global Futures Council on the digital economy at the World Economic Forum, and for my sins spent 3 years on the consumer board at Ofcom, the telecoms regulator. Dept.
Hi, I'm an AI professor. This is my 35th year in the field, I think, and my third AI hype cycle. If you've used things like Google Translate or Yahoo Translate or Microsoft Translate or Baidu Translate, I pioneered those, built the first of those, and developed a lot of the machine learning foundations. Today, my research is oriented toward pushing machine understanding of language to far deeper levels, because even though I was among a very small group of people way back in the 80s and early 90s pushing for machine learning and probabilistic approaches to AI, today what we're seeing has to some extent thrown the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that instead of building models that are able to generalize the same way that human kids are able to generalize from small amounts of data and small amounts of computation, we're just sort of brute forcing things and throwing massive amounts, like 1 million times or more data at a problem than it should take, and 1 million times or more computation at a problem than it should take. And those are the solutions to problems in computational creativity, in music, in computational social science, and so on.
Hi, I'm Joanna Bryson. I actually did also start working in artificial intelligence in 1986, but I was working actually from the perspective of psychology. So I was trying to understand human natural intelligence, how it works, not just human intelligence, all kinds of species, why it's different. But in doing that, I did a PhD at MIT in the 1990s, and I noticed then that people can be very strange about AI, that they tend to think if a robot is shaped like a person, they think that they have an obligation towards it, even if there's a better robot sitting next to it that's shaped like an insect that actually works. They ignore that robot and look at the one that looks like a person. So I've been involved in AI ethics since then, but my PhD was actually in making AI that's safe, that's to make it easier for ordinary programmers to build AI. Because no matter, even if you use this fantastic machine learning, just conceptualizing an algorithm doesn't make it burst into a robot in front of you. It's always a human that decides to build AI, how to build AI, which data to train it if you use machine learning, and these sorts of things. So right now I'm mostly working in the area of AI policy.
Fantastic.
Oops.
Hello?
Sorry.
Someone turned it off. Is this on now? Yeah, you can hear me. Great. So we're going to be talking about governance and accountability in the AI world. And I propose what we do is use the time available to start with a little bit of level setting. Let's get some definitions out there briefly, talk a little bit about some of the very short-term issues that we are running into, and then think a little bit about what this really means in the long term, what the institutional solutions might need to be. So perhaps we can just kick off very straightforward, very broad audience out here. What do we mean by governance? Joanna, do you want to give a brief definition?
Well, yeah, as I said, I actually worked in action selection, so I think about this all the time. Governance does include having governments, but what are governments? They're not weird space aliens that got dropped, just like robots aren't weird space aliens that got dropped into the world. They are the means by which, at least in a democracy, they're the means by which we coordinate ourselves. So there's internal governance, and that was actually also what we do in AI. You have modules that you try to make the modules do as much as they can on their own. But then sometimes it's just easier to make a clean, clear, safe module by having some kind of coordination that's in a different module that has a special duty to do that coordination. So it's important to realize that you don't have to be the most important thing or even the most powerful thing, but you have to have the facilities to get stuff done. And good governance, at least historically, they thought to make sure that the government itself doesn't get corrupt. And you need a bunch of mid-sized companies, not ones that have become too powerful, so the government can keep track of them, and they keep track of the government, and there's a mutual kind of thing like this. Now, of course, citizens do it too.
Right, so governance is essentially about, I guess, coordination of resources and conflicts in a system. What does that mean in the context of artificial intelligence, DK? Why do we even have this session?
So I think one of the things that we've seen repeatedly in the discussions about ethics and AI and the massive social impact of AI, much of which has not been terribly positive, it rises from the fact that there are limitations to rule-based systems. I mean, of course, nobody wants to throw out rules. We need to have that. But I think at the same time that we do that, we have to understand that AI is an exponential amplifier of all things human, the bad and the good. And just as rule-based AI fell short because the real world really isn't rule-based. Rules are a metaphor. And so what happens is that you end up with contradictions, paradoxes between your rules very quickly. And I think at the same time that we're thinking about, well, what are the rule-based orders that we need to construct around AI, we have to understand that rule-based AI ethics will also fall short. When you have any simple problems, and I don't want to bring up the trolley problem yet again, you immediately run into conflicts between the logical rules. And so I think it's also super important to understand in the context of AI ethics, the role not only of rule-based ethics, but also of old school virtue ethics, old school consequentialist ethics. How do you make trade-offs in order to resolve the messy paradoxes between the rules? And that goes back to the character of us, of humans, which is being amplified by AIs.
We've gone back to Aristotle very quickly. Joanna.
Yeah. I just want to jump in here because I want to dispute a few of the things you said, although I agree with some of them too. It's certainly true that it was a massive revolution in the 1990s when we started thinking probabilistically. And if there's something I could change about grade school education, I would love kids to understand that you have to act before you're totally certain. It's not about true and false. It is about dealing with these coordinations. But at the same time, I would say that AI, first of all, hasn't been more bad than good. You said at the beginning, maybe you didn't mean that, but I would say that, yeah, okay.
The good and the bad, I said.
Yeah, no, that was in the middle. Towards the beginning, you said that a lot of the things. Well, anyway, the point is that as the Secretary of State just said, I do think we have done an incredible amount of expanding our own abilities, and we don't even notice. We just take for granted the tools we have, and that we are so much smarter than we used to be, that we can walk into a strange city anywhere. We don't have to know the language. I mean, it's a little bit dangerous what we expose ourselves to, and we can find the best coffee shop. We can find some place to sleep, and we can communicate to people. That's amazing what we've done. But going back to the rule-based systems, they worked, and they're still used. They're fantastic for things like checking circuits and things like that. They were things that we used, and we somehow didn't pay attention to them because, again, they didn't look that human-like to us. So there's lots of different ways to solve AI, and I do think sometimes when you're trying to keep on track of what a system's doing, if you do use some of these more complicated ways of building AI, you can also have some of the simpler systems sort of running a ring fence around it to make sure that the system is doing what you want to do. So I like a hybrid approach using all these technologies.
And now we need to jump into perhaps what is for the insiders the elephant in the room. A few weeks ago, Google, which is essentially the biggest AI company in the world, decided it would be helpful to have an external ethics advisory council, which would be some kind of governance mechanism. My two esteemed guests were both appointed to that council, which dissolved faster than a tweet that you delete because you can't edit your tweets. What happened? What was Google trying to do, and what happened there?
So I think the thing about that saga was that we actually saw
long enough to be a saga. It was like a
mini saga, a micro saga.
Yeah.
Was that it was actually an excellent example of what we've seen: the amplification by AI and social media and interconnectivity of things that had not been thoroughly fact-checked. I saw headlines from top media outlets, I won't name them right now, that said things like independent oversight board terminated after less than a fortnight. Number one, if it's a body set up by Google, how on earth could it be independent? That would be some of the other groups that some of us are working on. Number two, nowhere did Google ever say this was oversight. Google actually spent 6 months between June last year when they defined the Google AI principles and December building their internal 3 levels of oversight review boards and education programs. This was an external advisory council that was designed to bring in voices that could well articulate cultures from outside the Google California culture bubble, so that they could better be informed and think through, analyze the unintended consequences of policy decisions outside the California bubble. And of course, it was never named a board. It had no governance. It was more like a focus group, a working group to bring those voices in.
Council.
Our opinions, it was a council. Our opinions were not things that we could force upon Google. It was for information. And so I think that this blew up in a way amplified by AI because this came across every single feed that is actually illustrative of the problems that we face with AI.
Right.
Yeah,
Please.
Okay. So when you first said the elephant in the room, I immediately thought Brexit, but you know, Google is bigger than Brexit. I mean, it's not bigger than the UK. Well, I don't know. I don't think so. I think the UK. But one of the things that's really important, I won't disagree with anything that was said about the way that Dekai did a really great job of describing where we were supposed to be. But I will dispute one thing about this being a flash. You know, when Dinas Hassabis sold his company to Google, he talked about that there has to be an ethics board. And I remember thinking, in fact, I found out about that like on Newsnight. It was the first time I was on Newsnight with Nick Bostrom. You know, that I thought, that's something I'd love to be a part in. I wonder how you get to be a part of that. And then when I met people that did policy at Google, I just sort of volunteered and helped them out with things and whatever, you know. So it's something, and then they had us, I don't know when you got signed. I got signed in like November last year.
It was about October last year for me.
Okay, yeah, you were before me then. But it was like, so this is not something that happened in 2 weeks. And again, it was a huge process, and yet something collapsed really quickly. And I think that it tells us not only about what happened, you know, in the viral and in the Twitter, but also about governance. And we're all trying to deal with these pressures, including these big companies. But what I really wanted to say, and I've just realized I've gone on at length, but I want to come back to this main point, is it's worth engaging with Google because it is a world power. And it is because that it's a world power that they also need to engage with all sides of the political spectrum. You know, we need to start negotiating with these large organizations and figuring out how to govern them. As I said before, we're good, you know, a nation can govern the small or medium-sized companies that are in that government, but there is no one government that is in charge of all the countries where Google has impact. And so we need to figure out a way to bring this into the world order, including getting these companies to pay their taxes.
Well, next year it's 75 years, the 75th anniversary of probably the most famous global compact on governance, which is the UN Charter, when 51 particular countries came together. Some countries were excluded, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh as an example, because they were under colonial domination at the time. And that was the last time, I suppose, that we saw something that was really as significant and as global as that. But to your point, Joanna, we do have state-scale, non-state actors, Google, Facebook, Amazon, the big three from China. And we also see the global south rising. We see much more regionalism and pan-regionalism emerging. How do you think that will affect the nature of a governance solution for AI? Perhaps, Dekai, you might have a perspective there and come to Joanna.
So I've had the privilege of, over the last decades, coming up on 30 years now, witnessing right up close AI development in the world's 2 largest AI ecosystems. So I come from Berkeley, my PhD was there, but I was hired with 400 people, heavily from Berkeley, to establish the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And I saw Hong Kong go from being a place where we still had shanty towns and across the border, Shenzhen was nothing, to a place where, you know, everything's being made in Shenzhen, and my university has produced, you know, DJI, the drone company, and everything else. So it's been a remarkable growth. And at the same time, I see things like China now having, Jimmy Carter pointed out, 18,000 miles of high-speed rail built in the last decade, whereas in California, I'm still waiting for the high-speed rail that I've been promised all my life. And so watching how AI develops in these regions is an exercise in understanding comparative cultures, because of course there are severe weaknesses in all of the systems. We don't need to get into that at the moment, but we have really, I think, a situation where the same kinds of approaches, whether Google's enforcing them or Amazon's enforcing them, work very well in the complex dynamics of one system and generate unintended consequences that don't actually work in other systems. And I think this is something that was really important. This was very important for the Google Council to be able to bring this out, because to me, one of the most unethical things that you could do is to not do all the work to predict the unintended consequences.
So I want to say to what you said, and in contrast to what I may have sounded like I was saying, Google is nothing like Pakistan, okay? So there are certain things that are really essential that nations do for us, or at least regional governments, including that we have citizens. And under the UN human rights, that conception, every person who's within the borders of a nation, it's the obligation of that nation to defend their human rights, not just their citizens, right? So they both are constructed of citizens, but have obligations over a land territory, right? So in that, we wouldn't ever expect that big tech is quite like that. They do have employees, they have users and people that they might want to defend the rights of from their governments. Again, there's a two-way street there. But I think it's really important to look at what was achieved with the GDPR. A lot of people thought, well, people don't take the EU seriously enough, I would say. And they thought, how can these guys just make up these regulations? They don't have the tech companies there. The idea that because they don't have giant tech companies in EU means that they're not AI ready or something is just like, no, that means that they're actually well regulated and they don't let companies get that much power just out of the blue. But anyway, they were able to, because it was a massive market, it's like 500 million people that are well off, that then all the tech companies were willing to sign up and deal with this. There's a few really tiny companies that if you try to go there from an EU IP address, they're just like, no, we don't want to deal with it. But by and large, even small companies are supporting GDPR.
But I'm curious about this governance question being broader than bringing the GAFAs, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, to heel. That it seems to me that the AI governance question, because it is a technology very unlike, say, uranium enrichment, which only large, rich states can do, it is a highly perfused technology that is being used by states, by non-state actors, by medium companies, small companies, seems to me that the AI governance question is broader than just getting Amazon to be a good corporate citizen.
Oh, no, you're totally right here. And that's something that everybody had to sign to GDPR at every scale. And that's actually one of the criticisms that people made was like, it's expensive to do this, so it might cut out the small companies. But we can facilitate that. And we can also make it the obligations of the large companies to help the small companies. That is something we do when we regulate. That most regulation is about making stuff work. It's like like the Secretary of State just said, we're mostly there helping to make things work. Regulation is a positive thing that helps the ecosystem work together. But that was defending all the citizens of the EU, that their data could not be used against them, basically. That the data is part of the citizen, and it's defended as a citizen, so that you can't just start nudging a citizen of the EU without their permission.
But Dekai, do you think this is just about the big six companies, or is it broader than?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's much broader than that, because really the same techniques are being used by thousands, tens of thousands, and I'm sure shortly far larger than that. We are surrounded by millions of AIs, and today the tools of AIs are not the Hollywood trope, again, of the logical systems, the systems that can't understand human emotion and can't deal with context and are black and white. It's all the machine learning stuff that we're seeing now. And so what does that translate to in the complex dynamics of society? What it means is that every single one of those shortly millions of AIs, small ones, not the big companies, are imitating. They're learning from what you and I do. They're learning by observing our actions, by the tasks that we give them, by the attitudes that they observe us doing. This is the nature of machine learning. And as they're doing that, they're taking that culture that they're picking up from us being embedded in, and then reflecting it back into society. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does that do to society? And as long as we keep, again, not to say we should not be thinking about legislation and the right rules, but I think it is also at the same time supremely important for us to understand the limits of that. Society is not held together only by the rules, the written laws. Most of the way, I mean, if people walked around and did nothing all day but obey the letter of the law, society would fall apart. What the glue that holds us together are the unspoken rules, the shared norms, the values. And just as AI, machine learning especially, is an exponential amplifier of all things human, that goes as well. And so if we think about how the machines are picking up our actions and then reflecting that exponentially back into society, that's where the hidden danger actually really is, because we are actually the training data. And so think about what happens when that gets amplified into that dynamic. So we have to be looking both at the rule-based ethics and also thinking very much about what it means to be human, what it means to be a member of society, because that's going to get exponentially amplified as well.
I'm sorry, can I?
Please, yeah.
Because I again totally agree, like 90%. That the one piece that I would change in what you said was that I don't like to say, oh, the machines are doing this. We are doing this with machines. Individuals, companies of all different scales and sizes are doing this. And also, I want to point out that the other big thing that we need to govern, it does make sense to think about not just data that's sitting there and that you've archived and you've typed in, but the Internet of Things, this whole concept of having constant sensors everywhere where you don't know if it's being recorded or who will use it later. One of the big problems with digital technology is, I mean, it's both the great part of it, but also the scary part of it, is that it replicates so completely, not entirely completely, but amazingly completely, and that information could be there for a long time. So you could have a government you totally, utterly trust, and you can tell it everything you want it to know, and then it can optimize, the citizens' lives and make everything better. But that same data is just sitting there, and another government comes in, and all of a sudden, that information can be used in a horrific way that you weren't anticipating.
Absolutely.
So these are some of the things about how do we defend people's rights to innovate and to create and to be different, and then make sure that, at some point in the future, they won't be picked out as, oh, you're the potential troublemaker.
I'm going to let you come in on this, and we're going to switch topics. Go for it.
Yeah, I think again, just to take that a step further, while it's super important to try to do what we can, I think we also need to think beyond that and understand the unintended consequences, because data just leaks. Things are observable. And so we'll try as hard as we can, but it's still going to leak, and we have to, at the same time, ask ourselves, what do we do about that, right? There's a lot of thinking right now, which is a little bit incremental in the sense of what can we tweak in our rules so that status quo is preserved? And we do have to understand that what we're facing right now with AI has no precedent. Status quo, like it or not, is going to be massively affected. And so the unintended, the hidden dynamic there is that data is going to come out. And what do we do about that? Yeah, despite that? Well, if you rewind a few hundred years ago, we do have to realize that our current modern Western notion of privacy is actually a historical anomaly. Through the history of humanity, those notions of privacy did not exist the way that they currently do. And societies functioned in different ways. And I think we do need to also expand our minds at the same time and think, well, okay, if there's going to be a certain amount of data leakage, because machines will learn from machines will learn from machines, and that is also data leakage, then how do we rethink what the complex dynamic of society is with both the humans and the machines interacting?
So there are definitely some complex interactions and some novel emergent behaviors, which we've spent a bit of time talking about. But you also mentioned earlier in one of the previous responses this idea of shared values. And shared values and common ground is a critical component of building a governance system. It's what brought people together in San Francisco in 1945 for the signature of the UN Charter. How will we go about finding shared values? What are the levels? What is the level at which that happens? When we look at a society over the long term, which has demographic changes, there are cultural differences. India is a power block, China is a power block, Sub-Saharan Africa has many power blocks. within the UK, the US, Western Europe, we're seeing an increasing divergence of values. So what is the mechanism by which we discover what those values are at these fractal levels?
Yeah, that's a great comment, and I wanted to bring that up the last time you brought up the UN. One of the really interesting moves that I've seen in the AI ethics sphere in the last sort of 12 months, at least since I've noticed, is that, you guys stop trying to make up new things. We've been negotiating for 75 years about what human rights are. So every country has different problems. It's true, and that we have different problems caused by what is our geology, who are our neighbors, what kinds of things can we do, and so that will drive different ideas about what security feels like and what the trade-offs are between privacy and security. And
so is that a suggestion that you use the existing institutions to tease out these values?
No. But on the other hand, despite the fact that we all have these differences, we have come together and we've spent a bunch of time negotiating this common floor of what's the minimum you have to do to support people. Now, yes, not everybody's on top of that, and everybody's had the same size chair at the desk, but I think we have to respect the systems by which we're already doing that negotiation, and we need to work with, diplomats and politicians and business leaders. It will all change. It is all changing. Again, that was that. I'm agreeing 98% with what you said, but it's not in the
event in this community, and it's really striking how we look at diversity issues, right? The two biggest ecosystems in the world for AI are in Silicon Valley and China. Look around you. What is the voice here? And this has happened at every single one of the meetings that I've been to. Now, when we talk about universal, you have to ask, what are we actually talking about here? There's, in the study of ethics, there's a strong distinction between prescriptive ethics and descriptive ethics. In prescriptive ethics, that's the normative stuff. That's like, I'm going to tell you what the rules are that you need to obey, right? That's your grammar school teacher. But in descriptive ethics, that's the scientific part. That's where you go and you actually embed deeply into different cultures, very different cultures, and you describe how are those systems of ethics interacting with society so that they sustain and become stable. And I do think that, to answer your question, we need to do our groundwork. We need to do a lot more homework in the descriptive ethics situations, because before you rush to prescription, you need to understand the unintended consequences of how those prescriptions might play out in societies that have very different education levels, that have different shared cultural norms, that have different models of governance and so forth. I think to get to where Azeem wants us to go, we need to do that, come together and have a joint conversation that is more balanced.
And where does that coming together?
Okay, go. Because this time I only agree about 20% with what you said. Personally, I was just at a meeting, was it 2-3 weeks ago, in Seoul, Korea, where it was the joint OSCE and ASEAN meeting. And so it was, more than half people from the Pacific region, mostly Koreans, to be honest, because the Koreans had hosted it. But still, and the other really great meeting I was at not too long ago was the Internet Governance Forum, which is put on by the UN, and they really make sure to have people who aren't usually heard from there. They do the Global South, South Americans. There are incredible regional people who will then come out into those meetings when you have them, and they really have great voices. And actually, one of them was Twitter. Right? They were astounded to be at the table, but they're like, you guys are causing power. You may not be as rich as these other countries, but you're changing things. You have to sit at these tables too. And they were looking embarrassed to be there,
So you think that there's more coherence and consistency across values?
So that was the other thing. Even more importantly, I really disagree that descriptive ethics is in any way prescriptive ethics. It is true that you need to understand the cultures and the affordances, but there's a lot, my group...
I'm distinguishing between the two.
Okay. But you said we needed to do more work understanding what people were already doing, and I think that's sort of true, but we cannot use that and say that AI has to do what people already do.
So the level of nuance that I'm seeing in the discussions of ethics are still, even in meetings like this, and I was in Beijing with Partnership on AI 2 weeks ago. I've been at a lot of these meetings. The composition of the room is extremely different. Even in those situations, what you see is a handful, maybe 2 representatives from the 1.3 billion population Chinese, and the rest are European. Of course, accepting the host country, you always have a lot of people from the host country. What you don't see right now is the nuances in the descriptions. If you look at, for example, the IEEE documents that were submitted at the European Union a few months ago, the descriptions of ethics dived into all sorts of Western ethics traditions that were quite nuanced. The description of others were relegated to not quite a footnote, but they were really, really brief. I don't know if you looked at the section on Buddhist ethics. That was a very narrow sliver of Buddhist thought, and the rest just sort of fell by the wayside.
I agree that IEEE tried to do a lot of reach out, but then they didn't actually facilitate. I agree, and they also didn't succeed. But other organizations are succeeding, including organizations that are being pushed from that. And I have been to a lot of meetings where they are. They still get like disproportionately British and American people, probably because we're so talkative.
I'm gonna pull the slightly nerd klaxon alert there. We've got 3 minutes left, and I want to touch on let's pull back out now. The last most significant governance compact we have, I think, is the soon to be 75-year-old UN Charter. If we think about a governance charter for AI, for the AI-enabled world, one that is going to last the distance against the backdrop of a fracturing and fragmenting world which is sitting on top of a set of exponential technologies. What does the institution need to look like in order to last the distance and in order to be able to course correct and trim itself against these types of underlying dynamics?
Oh, now you want me to go first.
Yeah, and you've only got a minute, so.
Yeah, no, I think I really, really like the model of the EU. I like the idea that you make a lot of treaties, but then the nations themselves are the ones that have the courts, that have the armies, that have the laws. And so I think we need to come up with some other hubs, so globally different regions will have different things that work for them, and then have a coordinated network between those hubs. And then they will form treaties with other tech organizations about what they're allowed to do within those regions that are being governed that way.
I'm going to complement that. I think that what we need is like exponentially more people-to-people contact. All the issues that we're talking about right now come from where people have depth of understanding versus where people have the most superficial of understanding. And the best way to get over that is for individuals across these cultures to get to know each other better. And to learn to love what is great about other cultures. And we have to do this on a mass scale. Now, traditionally, that's been really difficult. Now we have AI and the internet. That is what we should be using AI and the internet to do.
Well, thank you to both of you. There is so much more to discuss in this. I know that you have sort of public presences as well. What is a good way to keep in touch with you, Joanna?
Oh, the best thing to do is to try to tweet at me, because that keeps it short and I might actually read it. But you can try emailing me. If you either tweet at me or you email me and I don't respond, try again in a couple of days, because every so often I just get infinite amounts of stuff and I don't know.
And it's J2 Bryson, is that right?
J2 Bryson on Twitter, yeah.
How about you, Dekai?
I'm going to get massive flack for this. Facebook, hit me up, Messenger, Dekai1, Dekai1. You can tweet at me at Dekai123, but I don't guarantee that to work as well.
Yeah, it depends what's happening there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I want to make one tiny announcement before we clear the stage. At 12:30 on my stage, Cutting Edge, the second geodesic dome, I have Thomas Reardon, who will be talking about neural interfaces, mind-controlled interfaces. Reardon's a really great storyteller, and if you have time, I would encourage you. It will be standing room only, so get there early. And thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you.